Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Discussions of Darkness. This week I wanted to talk about a topic that I feel very passionately about, both as a storyteller and as a player, but it's also one that I have seen a lot of people trip and stumble over, and it's something I thought I would talk about and hopefully present some solutions and some insights that make things a little easier at your table. And now we all read the title, we know what I'm going to talk about, but to set the scene and begin at the beginning. The World of Darkness and the Chronicles of Darkness are both games set nominally in the real world and in the modern day. Now, modern might be the 1990s, it might be the 2000s, it might be today's date. But whatever it is, the games use that hidden world trope, and for that to really work, it has to be the world in which we all live and which we are familiar with. Whether it be a world that was around when we were teenagers or a world that we live in today and can look out the window to see. But as a lot of storytellers have no doubt discovered, there are a lot of resources, a lot of technologies, and a lot of solutions that exist in our day-to-day right now that can punch serious holes in plots if we don't plan for them. A good example of that, if you've ever watched a horror movie from the 80s and thought to yourself, man, we could solve this entire plot if our protagonist just had a working cell phone, you already know where this is going. And it's that there are a lot of things we just take for granted today that can really undermine the danger of a situation and give players a lot of options you may not really want them to have as a storyteller. And a lot of storytellers will just clamp down on when something does or doesn't work and refuse to let certain non-supernatural solutions play out. And a big reason for that is when a storyteller has a certain idea, often they require a supernatural solution to a supernatural problem, and they'll just not want to hear anything else. But even if your players come up with a legitimate idea, a really clever idea in a lot of cases, or they'll make a point about a technology that was available, or they'll have an unusual idea for how to solve a problem. Perhaps they want to fly a drone over to spy on the vampire cabal. Maybe they have this idea of building a homemade firearm that is far more powerful than anything they could get on the market and fill it with silver shrapnel, and that's how they want to deal with werewolves. But rather than just saying no, because that's both going to discourage your players and it's going to break immersion. If something could work in the real world, if something is available as an option, and you tell them no, that doesn't work here, it's really going to make them start questioning how real this real world we're supposed to be part of is. And I wanted to take a moment to sort of tug on everyone's sleeve for a moment and point out that embracing the modern setting, really embracing all of the things that come with it, has a lot more benefits than it does drawbacks. It might be a little frustrating from time to time, but what you get is far more than what you give up. As an example, there's something I tend to think of as the urge of supernatural supremacy, particularly that a lot of storytellers have. And what this means is that lots of storytellers have this idea that if there is a supernatural power, if there is an enchanted item for whatever form that takes, depending on what game you're playing, that thing should be inherently better or stronger or more powerful than any non-supernatural solution. And as an example, there was a werewolf game that I was once a part of, and the storyteller's entire argument for why certain firearms should not be allowed is those firearms dealt more damage and were more reliable than a magic throwing hammer someone had created. And when you phrase it that way, it sounds ridiculous, because the item in question is real. You could find it at various shops throughout town. The game was set in Northwest Indiana, and it's one of those things for anyone who hasn't been to Indiana. We have extraordinarily lax firearm laws out here. So the idea that someone could not just acquire that weapon and use it really broke immersion. And it was a series of issues that I feel the storyteller in question was not really thinking about regarding this. All they could think was, this player's magical item should take precedence over something you can just buy at a corner pawn shop. And while I see that, I would also point out that as a storyteller, if you find yourself feeling this way about things, whether it's cell phone communication, whether it's robotics, whether it's just guns in general, take a moment and remind yourself of something very important that exists as a central core feature of World of Darkness games, and that is the Masquerade, the Veil, whatever you want to call it. These characters, these worlds, these communities have to keep themselves secret. That's a major part of these games. It's why you're not always allowed to just go full bore with all of your supernatural powers. You can't be feeding on people in broad daylight. Well, not in broad daylight if you're a vampire, but in broad moonlight, you can't just go out and feed on people on the street. If you're a werewolf, you can't have your shift in view of the public and just go wild, even if you're doing something heroic. If you're a mage, there are actual penalties for using your magic where people who don't know what you are can see it. Changeling can't just reveal themselves and do what they do and expect no pushback. And that's honestly what a lot of the supernatural solutions are good for, is when you have to maintain that kind of subtlety. Because if someone is investigating a scenario, if someone is interviewing witnesses, if someone is talking about how a certain incident could have happened, at no point in time is someone going to write down on a police report, was probably magic. It's great for subtlety, it's great for maintaining that lie to the rest of the world that there are no supernatural creatures, there is no magic, everything is fine, move on about your lives. But if you have players utilizing strictly mortal, strictly non-supernatural solutions to problems, as a storyteller, this does two things for you. First, it opens the door. It lets you know that if the players are using it, it's now fair game for you to use it. Theoretically, you could always do this. You're the storyteller. You have access to everything in the book and everything in the world. But it's seen as good form for you not to pull out the big guns unless the players are doing it first, because then you're sort of washed clean of responsibility for escalation. If they're the ones who started escalating things in this arms race, you're just following up what they did. And as a good example for that, players who wanted to bring in serious military hardware to deal with a situation. Let's say there's a brewing gang war between two groups of supernatural creatures, and your players decide, well, I have all of this money, I have all of these connections, I'm going to get military surplus vehicles, I'm going to arm us and arm our allies. Cool. Good idea. It works, or at least it should work, and it will give you that advantage for at least that one battle. But once your players have done that, you now have the opportunity to do that for their antagonists. And that's going to lead to further escalation, and that could cause problems. But there's also the issue that real-world solutions leave real-world trails. So say we had that very potent gang war with a lot of this former military hardware. That's going to leave shell casings, it's going to leave purchasing records, there's going to be witnesses as to what was going on, unless you took very close care to do all this where no one would see or hear it. But if mortal authorities start investigating these things, they're going to find that paper trail, they're going to find out who acquired these, they're going to be able to actually track down and trace what's going on, and that's very bad for your players. Whereas, if someone just walks around with a magic hammer, to go back to the previous example, no one's going to believe that. It's just someone walking around with a sledgehammer. That's perfectly legal, not even worth a second glance. Whereas someone walking around with a fully automatic riot shotgun is going to lead to, at the very least, people calling the authorities, wondering what the hell's going on. And you see this with all sorts of other solutions as well. If someone chooses to consult the spirits via possession and find information about the current target of your investigation that way, there's no way to trace that. No one really knows what's going on unless they also have supernatural powers. But if someone just hacks into the police database and steals the information that way, they'll get the same information, but now there's going to be an actual gap in the physical security that someone could come across, and if they don't cover up their tracks, that could lead authorities back to them wondering why you were committing felonies to steal information from a governing body. And this is something that is very important to consider both for players and for storytellers when it comes to going back and forth on the line, is if your players are using non-supernatural solutions, they're going to leave tracks that you can find with non-supernatural means. But it goes the other way as well. If your antagonists either don't have access to supernatural powers or choose not to use them to maintain that secrecy, there's going to be a trail left, and that trail can act as a clue for players to follow. So it's really a benefit if you want to get them to go in a certain direction. You can leave something for them to follow and just make them think it was their own idea to go after it that way, using their more mortal skills, their useful technologies, things like that. And an important thing to keep in mind here is what I am not saying is that you should open the floodgates and give your players anything they ask for, anything they conceive of. That is a terrible idea and is definitely going to lead to an arms race that's going to cause problems in the setting, and it's going to spiral out of control very quickly. But it is also important that the best way to think of it is if you were having an argument with your parents and you raised a viable point and their immediate reaction to it was to shout that they were in charge and they were the parent and you need to shut up, that's basically how it feels when you're a player and you come up with a solution that isn't what the storyteller expects and they just shut it down. At the same time, it is completely legitimate that certain things will not work in certain situations, but you as the storyteller need to have some reason that doesn't work other than I didn't plan for it and don't want to deal with it. A good example of that is, say someone wanted to fly a drone into the sky to sort of spy on a vampire cabal. Good idea. Would have worked. What they didn't know is that one of the vampires in question has a ghoul that is this extraordinarily powerful griffin eagle. And so when the drone comes into its airspace, it just destroys it. There's no idea what happened. If they can even find the downed drone, it'll be torn into pieces. And so that's an example of a way that you can show that their idea was good and it would have worked, but they didn't have all the information about the situation. Similar to if they wanted to make phone calls into a certain area. Normally, it would have worked fine, but in the middle of this particular blood ritual, there's atmospheric disturbances that are creating quite a problem, and so it just isn't going to work. Things like that are important to keep in mind, and they really help maintain that immersion, they maintain buy-in, and they don't make the players feel like they're just being told there's only one way to solve this problem, stop thinking outside the box. But lastly, and this is something that might be a little more extreme for some storytellers, but it is worth keeping in mind, is if you don't want to deal with whatever modern solution players have, whether it's you don't want people acquiring like powerful weapons, you don't want them using technological solutions to deal with a problem, you always have the option of running in an earlier time period. As I mentioned, the 90s and the 2000s, but the World of Darkness goes back far earlier than that. There are not a full line of books to support every time period in history, but we've seen the Dark Ages, we've seen the Victorian era, we've seen the Old West, we've seen the Prohibition era. There are so many other eras you could go to if you want to just lower the amounts of non-supernatural solutions and powers people have access to. But at the same time, it's important to remember that's not just an easy fix for this problem, because while you might not need to know how to counter overhead flights, you might not need to counter technologies that weren't invented until the 2000s, you do have to bring a greater knowledge of a historical period, because players who are aware of the world in which you are playing will be able to bring up things that you may not have thought of and that would be appropriate for the era in question, whether it's the ease of acquiring arsenic in the Victorian era because it just wasn't recognized as a poison yet, whether it was knowing precisely where one would get certain types of ridiculous weaponry in a post-Civil War setting where it was all being sold off for a government benefit. There are so many other options and so many other things to keep in mind that no matter when you're running, unless you are an expert on that period of history, something is going to come up that's going to throw you off your game. So, as a storyteller, it is far better to embrace technology and embrace the truth of the period you happen to be running the game in than to have preconceived notions of how problems must be solved. But that's my advice for this week. Hopefully, it helps put things in perspective and offers some interesting insights for folks who have been dealing with this particular problem. If you have something you'd like to see in a future installment of this show, leave your comments down below. And don't forget to check out my link. It takes you to all of my World and Chronicles of Darkness supplements thus far. There might be some historical supplements coming up in the future. If that's something folks would like to see, make sure you let me know. And until next time, happy gaming, everyone.